Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna, and I'll be your instructor this evening. We are streaming live from the South End Kitchen at City Market in Burlington, and Carrie from City Market is behind the camera here. So if you have any questions throughout the evening, feel free to just type them into the chat box, and she will be able to ask those questions, and I will try to respond. So I'm really excited to teach this class. I first encountered the Tarte Tatin when I was living in France when I was 19 years old before university. And the first bite of this tart at a little cafe, sort of street side cafe, was just so delicious. There was something so simple but complex about the caramel with the fruit and the sort of flaky buttery crust that I was just like, wow, I've never had a pie like this. Like, how is this different from the American apple pie? And so I sort of spent the next maybe 10 years or so sampling Tarte Tatin, living in Paris and Lyon, and then back in the States when I was in culinary school, really tried to understand better the pâte brisée, the pastry crust that's used, and why this creates such a delicious tart. So that is a little bit of my background and just sort of my love of this particular recipe. But I also thought it would be really fun at this time of year when there are so many amazing apples out and about for us to be kind of exploring some maybe slightly different apple desserts. Here in Vermont right now, it's sort of peak apple season, and I think everyone's been out picking apples. We've got some wonderful orchards with really great heirloom varieties, and here actually at City Market, it's amazing right now the selection that's available downstairs. If you're in the Burlington area, I'd encourage you to definitely check out the downtown or South End stores. It really almost feels like you're walking through an apple museum or a shrine to apples. There are like 20 different varieties, a lot of them heirloom varieties that you just can't come by many other places unless you have your own orchard. So this class is really in honor of all the apples that we've got available to us. So before we begin, I just wanted to say a couple words about kind of introducing us to French culinary technique. My training is in French culinary studies, and I believe that there are a couple crucial things that if we get those down, everything else is going to be just really simple and the end product is going to be good. So I'm going to be teaching you this recipe that I learned in culinary school at Le Cordon Bleu, and then also just some very general sort of techniques that we can try to follow and will make us better bakers. So number one, and I should say everyone has probably received the recipe packet. Carrie sent that out, so feel free to follow along. I advise, taking notes. Feel free to ask any questions if anything needs to be clarified. I've tried to give you the instructions both in the metric system in grams as well as by volume in the imperial system. But what my first point is, and those of you who've taken my classes before are familiar with this, is I generally recommend if you're kind of moving into precision baking, and French pastry doughs are really that. They're kind of a science, that you start measuring by weight using a scale rather than a measuring cup. And why is that? That's because when we dip a measuring cup into like a bag of flour, there are so many different ways that flour can behave. It can be really compacted, and we could have like 20 to 30 to 40 more grams of flour than we really need for the recipe. It's just a lot harder to be accurate when we're measuring by volume. So therefore, I would suggest investing in a scale. If you don't already have one, a lot of you probably do. There are some just great scales out there. Here in Burlington, Kiss the Cook is a local store that has really affordable, good quality scales. And the other thing after measuring by weight is to try to perhaps transition to the metric system. I found that measuring in grams versus ounces and pounds allows us to be just a little bit more accurate. We can measure down to the gram, and that's really great. So I've given both of those in the recipes, so you should be able to kind of get a sense. One thing we had to do in culinary school was get to the point where you could scale out butter or flour and be able to know without a scale how much like 100 grams of flour or butter would be. So that's kind of a fun exercise to work on. The other thing I wanted to say is that this recipe is extremely simple. I think we often think of American apple pie as this sort of challenging recipe to make, and then the Tarte Tatin even more complicated. But in fact, I sort of think of the Tarte Tatin as like a much simpler version of an American apple pie. You're only making one layer of the pastry crust, and the apples don't have to be cut into very small pieces. So if anybody's feeling intimidated to try this recipe, please don't, because it's super simple. And as we'll hear in a moment, the origins of this recipe were actually a kind of a mistake. And it's a very rustic and sort of free-flowing tart. That said, the proportions to the pâte brisée, the short crust pastry, do need to be pretty much precise. So my background is also in anthropology, cultural anthropology, and I always try to begin classes by sort of grounding our recipe in the region and the history and some of the culture that it has emerged from. So we sort of give credit to those who invented this recipe and have been baking it. So the Tarte Tatin, as it's called, and I think here in the States, sometimes we do hear Tarte Tatin, but in French, most of you know probably that last syllable when it's a consonant doesn't get pronounced. So it's tatin, so no N at the end, Tarte Tatin. We believe that the sort of recipe as we know it today dates back to the 1880s, when there were two sisters, les demoiselles Tatin, the Mrs. Tatin, who were running a hotel restaurant, which at the time it was very common to have both the restaurant and the hotel sort of as under one roof, just south of Paris, about 100 kilometers south of Paris. And they were really overworked, as is still the case in the food industry today, often. And these bakers and chefs were kind of doing so many things at once. And one day there was this huge dinner party, and one of the sisters, Stephanie, was trying to bake her dessert. She was making an apple pie. And the story goes that she completely forgot that she was making caramel, that she had some butter and sugar going on the skillet, and some apples in it. And she was off doing something else in the kitchen and suddenly smelled a horrible burning smell, came over and saw that her caramel had her butter and apples had turned into a really dark caramel. Dinner service was in like 5 minutes. She didn't have the time to make another dessert. And so what she did was she quickly rolled out some pastry dough and just threw it on top of the kind of caramelized, extra dark, burnt apples, and baked it. And she just threw it in the oven like that, and then it came out and she flipped it over, and voila, she served it to her guests. And the story goes that they were just amazed by how delicious this tart was. They'd never had anything like it, probably had never had a caramel that dark with apples. And so the story goes that is really how this tart originated, and then later what made this hotel run by the Tatin sisters famous. They became really well known for this tart. But there is a conflicting story that says that that wasn't the case, that she was just actually trying to make a regular apple tart and somehow had forgot to turn it upside down. So that another error, but slightly different. But it was really that these sisters didn't try to sort of get famous by this tart. There are no documented publications of the recipe during their time period, or they didn't appear in any cookbooks until much later, when it was, we think it was the restaurant in Paris, Maxime's, a very well-known restaurant that started serving it on their menu and called it the Tarte Tatin. So someone else giving these two hotel owners credit for it. So that's the story. I think as we often see in history, many wonderful dishes are the byproduct of a mistake in the kitchen. And so perhaps that was the case. But I did look up in Larousse Gastronomique, which is sort of an encyclopedia of French cooking and history around food. And they said that actually this type of upside down tart was already very common in the Salon region, where these hotel managers were operating well before they actually sort of made this tart famous. So there probably was a tradition of an upside down tart, but it just was these two who made it really famous. That said, I should mention that in France there are lots of different fruits that we can use in an upside down tart. So apricot, peach, pear certainly are very common, and you can also then go the more savory route And actually the crust that I'll be teaching you today is a savory crust. So it's really versatile, and you can use it both for a sweet tart or something like a dinner tart with tomatoes are really good, with caramelized onions or mushrooms. So it's very, yeah, very versatile. But that concept of cooking something upside down so it sort of caramelizes close to the flame of the oven and then flipping it is a great sort of culinary concept that you can apply widely. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So this class wasn't really designed as a cook along. So I've prepped a lot of the ingredients already, but generally this wouldn't take you more than probably an hour or so to bake or to prepare and bake. But for the convenience of the class setting, I just wanted to let you know if you are cooking along, we'll be moving at a fairly quick pace. So first we're going to start the pâte brisée. What is pâte brisée? This is the pastry crust known as a short crust pastry that literally means broken. Pâte is sort of the dough, brisé, broken. Why is it called a broken dough? We think it's because the butter gets sort of combined with the flour to make these little, like very small balls or grains, almost like grains of sand. And it's a very rough dough that doesn't get sort of 100% fully incorporated. So it's a little bit sort of rough and maybe broken. You can think of it that way. So I've already scaled out my ingredients, but what you would do if you're measuring is to just start by putting whatever bowl you're going to use onto your scale and tarring it first. So that means we're bringing it down to 0. We're subtracting the weight of the bowl. And then you're going to pour your ingredient in, and that way you'll be able to see what it weighs. So I already did this with the flour. And this is 200 grams of all-purpose flour. You could also use a gluten-free flour if you're avoiding gluten. Nowadays, flour is pretty well milled and sort of pre-sifted, but if you want to be very precise, you could, shake it over a sieve and sift it. Then we're going to add in our salt. It says just a pinch of salt. This is kind of up to you. If you're doing a savory crust, you might want to put in a little bit more, a sweet crust, maybe a little less. The salt really is a key component, even for a sweet crust. Anytime you're adding sugar, it's important to include salt because that will bring out the flavor of the sugar. And it's interesting. Over the years, when I forget the salt, I automatically can taste it. Not that it's sort of this strange thing. It's like it tastes sweet, but not in that same like full-bodied sweet way as if you have a little bit of salt. So it's kind of interesting how the salt and sugar play together. And then we're just going to whisk that together. When you're dealing with dry ingredients, it's great to use a whisk. That's the quickest and fastest way to combine them. I should say this method I'm teaching you is the kind of old school traditional way of making the pastry crust by hand. You could, if you have a food processor, just kind of throw this all into a food processor, and that makes a pretty decent crust, pastry dough. But I wanted to show you this method. I think it's a little bit flakier at the end because you don't run the risk of over processing it with a blade. So there are 2 doughs that are very similar that could be used at this stage. And then I'm going to talk about a third dough later, which is a store-bought puff pastry. But a short crust pastry dough, by definition, does not have any sugar. It's sort of this bland base that then is flavored more by the sauce and the ingredients that it's sort of underneath. However, if sometimes for a particular dessert, especially if the fruit is more tart or acidic, it can be nice to add a little bit of sweetener to that crust. And so that would transform it into not just the pâte brisée, but the pâte brisée sucrée, so a sweetened pâte brisée. And it's at this stage where you would do that if you wanted to. I'm not going to for this recipe because I actually prefer it. I find that the caramel and the apples are so sweet that I don't like that extra bit of sweetness in the dough. But if you wanted to, or if you're working with apples that are really tart, you could put in maybe 1 or 2 tablespoons of sugar. I think about up to 25 grams, which is about 2 tablespoons is sort of acceptable without it being overly sweet. So our next step is to create a little well in the center. And I'm sure everybody has done this. This is always the fun part when you're a kid of like making a well, pouring in the wet ingredients and mixing it all up. And we're going to add butter. So the butter for this recipe is probably the most important ingredient. You want to look for an unsalted butter that is as high a fat content as possible. The butter in Europe and especially in France and England has a much higher fat content than here in the States. I think it's the breed of cows and the pasture. It enables a milk that has a higher fat content. So I like to use this Kerrygold butter here that we've got at City Market. If you're doing, a small scale baking, you can look for some of the homestead butters. They range from like $9 to $12 a pound. So when I do like a lot of baking, that's not really feasible economically, but that is what you want to aim for, is that butter that is the most yellow with the highest fat content. It's important that the butter be as cold as possible for this stage. So what I usually do is I will either sort of mince the butter when it's right out of the fridge and then put it back into the fridge or even the freezer right before adding it. Or a nice trick that can help with sort of blending into the flour is to stick the whole stick of butter into the freezer. And then right before you're using it, just grate it on a cheese grater. And that will form these like wonderful little sort of pieces or flecks of butter. And then you can keep it in the fridge until you're about to use it. And that's a way to kind of just get us a step ahead in the process of blending the butter and the flour. So what we're gonna do at this stage is our hands are washed, take a little bit of flour, rub them together with the flour, and we're going to start to combine the butter and the flour. This technique is called sablé, from the French word for sand, to make something sandy, to make it like grains of sand. And you can even kind of rub it together with your fingers. If you've got kids in the house who want to help, this is a really fun job. The trick is you want to make your hands as cold as possible to begin with. So if anyone's got really warm hands, just maybe run them under some cold water or handle some ice ahead of time, and that will help. So we're gonna rub this together until it's looking sort of coarse, like sand. Okay, so you can see the butter has sort of disappeared into the flour, and you can see these sort of larger pieces. Then we're going to sort of create our well again and add 1 egg. And again, the egg should be chilled. Some recipes call for just the yolk, but the original recipe we think contained both the yolk and the white. And we're going to blend these together. And this part doesn't have to be completely thoroughly done because you're going to be adding a little bit more liquid, and that is the water. So the recipe calls for about 10 milliliters of water. That's maybe like almost 2 tablespoons. You can add a little bit more if it's feeling sort of dry. And then we're just going to continue to blend these together. Now, a couple of substitution ideas. If you're avoiding eggs, you can actually just omit the egg and add the same quantity of water. Yogurt is another substitute you could try instead of the egg. And if you're avoiding butter, you could try some butter substitutes like margarine or shortening. But the thing that I love and actually prefer to butter for certain tarts is lard. That was the original fat that was used to make tarts. And if if you're able to have animal products, it makes a wonderful flaky crust, and it doesn't have really any kind of a porky flavor. You can look for leaf lard. Most sort of, yeah, old-timey butcher shops used to carry it, but I think you can find it now at places like Whole Foods or your local co-op. All right, so once the dough is starting to hold together a little bit, we can then dump it out onto the board. So you see, I'm trying to avoid having my fingers come in contact with any of the butter that hasn't had a coating of flour. So I use the dough to kind of wipe off the spoon. And then we're going to dump that out on the counter. Definitely recommend getting one of these. If your local King Arthur flour has them in Vermont, or any kind of kitchen store. And now we're just going to try to bring this together into a ball, maybe doing a little bit more of compressing and kneading. This is different from bread kneading. We're just trying to get it so that all of the fat is coated in the flour and everything adheres together. We're not trying to develop any gluten at this point. So once we've gotten it into a ball, just gonna make sure I'm telling you everything. Yeah, so we've got it into a ball. You can see it's still sort of a rough dough, and there's just like one last step that we want to do, and that is to basically smear the ball into the cutting board. And this is the brisée, and it's a step in a pastry dough that basically helps the butter get fully blended, and we're only going to do it maybe 2 or 3 times. So that means if there are any larger kind of pieces of butter, they're hopefully going to be blended without overworking the dough. All right, so that's it. You've got your dough ready. It does need to rest now for at least 30 minutes, preferably up to 2 hours. This is a dough that can be, it actually is great to make ahead of time. You can keep it for up to 2 days in the fridge. You'll just want to bring it to close to room temperature before using. It's hard to roll out if it's too hard still from the fridge. So I am going to get some plastic wrap. And oh, I should mention, this dough is actually very delicate. It's sort of robust and rustic in some ways, but the flavor of it is pretty delicate. So if you have anything strong smelling in your fridge, like I do at the moment, I have an open jar of kimchi, you definitely do not want to leave this at all exposed to the air. So just make sure it's nice and airtight. Maybe put that into a plastic bag, and then that can go into the fridge for half an hour. Thanks, Carrie. All right. So that was the pâte brisée. Just to summarize, you can use all sorts of substitutions. If you are trying to avoid gluten, you can use a gluten-free flour. You can use, instead of the egg, you can just use water. You could use flax plus water. You could use lard, margarine, shortening for the butter. So lots of different ways nowadays that we can kind of substitute for that recipe. Pardon? Oh yeah. So if you don't mind having the fat flavor be pretty strong, coconut oil is a great substitute. Yeah, I love the flavor of coconut oil, so that's great. It does come through a little bit more than the other fat. Are there any questions before we move on to the caramels and apple? No. Now's your chance to type in any questions you might have about the dough. Nope. Okay, well, we can come back to anything if you think of it. So you can see that was super simple. You don't need any fancy equipment. If you'd like, you could do that same process in a food processor. If I'm making like lots and lots of tarte tatin, I might tend to use the food processor just because it's faster to do in large batches. But yeah, it's a really simple dough to make. So the next step is to make the caramel sauce. And this, again, is super simple. So we're going to take some butter. And while the proportions for the dough are very precise, the caramel can be a little bit more flexible. So if you're not wanting to use that much extra butter, because one tart does contain a half a pound of butter. So if you're trying to reduce that, you could reduce the butter a little bit. But we are going to take, I think it is 113 grams. So why did I give you that measurement? That's because that is the weight of a modern day stick of butter. So 8 tablespoons weighs about 113 grams. And you want to use a skillet that is oven proof. The traditional way of making tarte tatin is actually to make the caramel and use that one pan to then bake it off. If you don't have an oven proof pan, that's no problem. We could use a regular pie pan or a cake pan, really anything that has the shape that you'd like to bake in. So again, this tart is super flexible.
All right, so I did have a question come through, and we're going to test out my headset, so hopefully the sound is okay for people. Somebody asked, why are the exact proportions so important?
Yeah, good question. It's really because of how the flour, fat, and sugar behave together. And to make that like super flaky, buttery crust, you're trying to maximize the fat. You're basically pushing the limits of how much the flour and the dough can hold, how much fat it can take before it's going to turn like runny. If you've ever made cookies, like chocolate chip cookies, like when I was a kid, I would experiment a lot with different ingredients, and sometimes I'd put in tons of butter and they just get all like flat. And that's what would happen if we didn't kind of measure the butter. So we're basically seeing how far we can go with the maximum amount of fat before, so the dough will still hold together. And this is, I should say, this is a very classic recipe. The 2-to-1 ratio of flour to butter is a very kind of standard. It probably dates back to way before the invention of this tart, probably to the 16 or 1700s. Escoffier would know. But that ratio plus 1 egg to make a pie crust is just a sort of almost like written in stone in the history of French baking. So yeah, I think anytime you're dealing with more of a sauce rather than the base of a dough, that's a sauce that doesn't involve flour, the precision of the ingredients isn't quite as important. Yeah, great question.
Great.
Thanks.
And there are a couple more in the chat, but I think we might actually get to them later. They look like maybe they're questions about later stages in the process. So I am going to leave those there, and I will ask them when they become relevant if they're not answered. How about that?
That sounds good. Okay, so make sure to ask us again if I don't get to those questions in the next sort of set of instructions, because I definitely want to get to them.
Somebody did ask if you can use a cast iron skillet for making the caramel.
Great question. Great question. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. So we think probably the original tarte tatin was baked in something like cast iron, perhaps copper, but I definitely have baked a lot of my tarte tatin in cast iron pans. They are great. They conduct the heat really well. They'll make a caramel without, oftentimes they won't burn the caramel as quickly as a stainless steel pan. The only drawback to a cast iron pan, if you're doing the 9 to 10 inch size, is that it is quite heavy. And when you add the tart on top of that and all of the apples, when you take it out of the oven, it's super hot, and you're only going to be waiting about 5 to 6 minutes for it to settle and cool slightly before you're flipping it. And I've often found that my propensity to mess up when I flip the tart or spill the caramel is higher when I am working with a really heavy cast iron pan. But you may be better able to do that. If you're going to flip it with the 2-hand method, that definitely works for the cast iron. But yeah, I think the cast iron is great. Actually, one of the test tarts I did to show you at the end of the class today was in a cast iron pan. So that's a great option. And most stainless steel pans, as long as they don't have like a plastic or anything on the handle that isn't oven safe, can go into the oven, even if they're not really branded or advertised as that.
Great. And 1 or 2 more questions about the crust real quick as you start making the caramel.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Somebody asked, is it better to place the shredded butter in the freezer to get it super cold? And then also, wouldn't the food processor make the butter too hot?
Yes, And that is one of the main reasons against using the food processor, is that that whirling blade after even a couple of cycles is just warming it up. And so if you're going to use a food processor, absolutely keep your butter in the freezer ahead of time to sort of compensate for that. And yes, that's great. If you're able to keep your butter in the freezer, just in general before, as long as it's not in large pieces, that would be good. That will work. If it's grated, then having it in the freezer is great. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We've sort of thought that mechanization has simplified our way of baking, and in many ways it has with the food processor or mixers and blenders. But it also requires us to be a lot more sensitive to the ingredients and how we're treating them, because there is that risk of just kind of macerating or treating the ingredients more than we want to. So if you're using tools, definitely just be extra careful about them. Okay. Is there one more question?
The only other one I can actually answer for now, yes, we are recording this. It will be posted on our website at a later date, and I will, in an email tomorrow, share the link of where you will be able to find that again at a later date. It won't be up tomorrow, but I will share the link to our other pre-recorded classes with you.
Great. So we've put our 1 stick of butter into the pan I'm planning to bake in, fully melted it, and then we are going to add just a pinch of salt. Anyone who likes salted caramel might want to add a little more than a pinch. I kind of like my caramel on the salty side. And you're putting the salt in first so that fully dissolves. And then we're going to add in the sugar. And this step is important to be attentive for. And I had spelled this out earlier. The butter and sugar can go from sort of like a soft young caramel to really dark very quickly. It really all depends on, what temperature your stovetop is at and sort of, how you're stirring. So you definitely want to monitor it carefully. And what we're aiming for is to watch as it goes from like a golden yellow to more of a hazelnut color. There are all kinds of different opinions about how dark to make your caramel for a tarte tatin. Keep in mind that the caramel will continue to caramelize and cook in the oven. And especially if you're making a larger tart, like a 9 or 10 inch, it will be in there at least 40 minutes. So it's going to get a little bit darker. So I try to go on the side of nicely browned, but not to the point of like it's about to burn, because it will get darker in the oven. You can always, at the end, give your tart a little bit of time under the broiler to darken it. But if it is too dark, there's not much we can do at that point.
Somebody has asked if you can do the crust in a blender.
Oh, interesting. I have never done that. I do use a blender more for more liquidy batters, like a pancake batter or a crepe batter. I think that with a batter that has so much cold butter, and the way that the blender is formulated, the butter would just kind of clog up the bottom blade, and the dry ingredients might not mix in together. But you could try it. If you're in a low risk situation without dinner guests arriving, you could give it a try. Yeah. So this is interesting. This is the first time I'm using this particular skillet. I brought it in because it was easy to transport for this class. And it looks like it's got sort of a hot spot, or else the burner does. And there's this one area where it's turning dark quickly. So that's why you are always going to want to monitor the heat when you're doing caramel. I think I say in the recipe packet, medium to high heat, but take that down a little bit if you're seeing that your caramel is getting brown quickly. A couple of substitutes. If you are not eating butter, caramel can also be made with water. There's a water-based caramel that's perfectly delicious. It probably wasn't what was traditional to this recipe, but it makes a great caramel sauce. And so you could just substitute water for the weight in butter. and just cook that, basically make a sort of a very strong, simple syrup and cook that down. And I know nowadays a lot of people are experimenting with different sugars, and you could probably try this with like a darker brown sugar, lighter dark brown sugar, and sort of see how that goes. Yeah, it would have kind of probably a little smokier of a flavor. You could also try coconut oil. Again, if you're happy having that coconut flavor in the tart.
So I have a question myself. Is it supposed to be that solid looking? Like I know caramel, is it going to go liquid when it's done?
This is really interesting because actually I usually use a different butter, and this is what we had at City Market. And this butter has a very high milk fat content, and I think that that's what is making it this this sort of almost like sort of dry and flaky, but it's sort of, it's usually a little bit like this, but oftentimes will be a little more, caramel.
I mean, it smells great, so I'm sure it'll still taste great.
No, it looks almost has that like brown sugar feel to it. Okay, so this is getting there. We are getting closer. If you have a helper, if there are two of you doing this, while one person is stirring the caramel, the other can be working on chopping the apples, because that is probably the most time-consuming part of this whole recipe. It's interesting. I was watching a lot of YouTube clips of French chefs, pastry chefs making this recipe this week, just trying to kind of remember back to culinary school, like how were we doing this, and like the official French way. And one of the chefs actually had butter that was like this, and I wondered watching him, like what made it so sort of thick. And I think, my guess is that it's the sort of milk fat in the butter.
I love it just changed in texture. Like
you
could
notice
watch
that?
it change.
Yeah, and it sort of just changed in the color too. So that's starting to look a little bit more like caramel. But the butter fat is definitely kind of coming through there. All right, so caramel continues to cook after it has been removed from the heat. So you might want to stop it a little before it's the desired brown color that you're looking for. So I'm gonna just set it slightly off the heat here while we talk about apples for a moment. Okay, so there are so many different apples that we could use for the Tarte Tatin, and I would encourage you to really, use whatever is local to you and that you like, a flavor and texture of apple that you like. I don't want to say that there's only, one or two different apples to use, because really the best ones are the ones that are growing near you and that are something that is sort of pleasant to your palate. That said, generally the characteristics we're looking for when selecting an apple for baking is an apple that has a very firm texture that will hold its shape even under like a long bake time. And apples that are really good to do that are the ones like Rayburn, Honeycrisp, some of the older varieties like Cox Orange Pippin. So the Cox apple, that's a really great baking apple in Great Britain. That's what often most baked goods are made with that have apples. I think a more modern variety that is very in vogue right now is the Pink Lady, which is a very, very firm, almost hard apple that has a very sweet flavor. And then Golden Delicious are often commonly used for Tarte Tatin. That said, oftentimes we're baking this tart out of the season when some of the more heirloom varieties are available. And so we tend to just go to whatever is more commercially grown and available in the supermarkets. So I think nowadays, like, at this season, it can be really great to just kind of look for those lesser known apples that have a really sort of firm texture and that might have a tart flavor. Because the caramel is so sweet, often we like to think of a sort of the apple as complementing the caramel, and so we'd be looking for something that's more like tart and acidic rather than that really sweet flavor of like the Pink Lady. So for tonight, I actually did a bunch of apple picking or apple picking up, not picking, I didn't pick these myself, from the UVM horticulture farm where I used to work. And they have just a wonderful variety of apples that, again, are hard to come by. And they had a variety called Arlette, which I really like the flavor of and are also quite firm and good for baking. Trying to see if I can give you any more details about the Arlette. If I wrote anything down. Yeah, I wish this is a class where I really wish we could like do an apple sampling because there are just so many great flavors out there. And another good apple, let me show you these. Yeah, so this was, I think, the Braeburn, or no, this is the Honey Crisp, or often like a good size apple, have kind of these like lines, a good blend between like green and red. And I think most people have had those. They're really crisp and sweet. And then this was this was the Lady Pink. You can see how pink that is. And if you cut into it, there's a little bit of the pink still on the white. It's a delicious eating apple. I tend to not bake with it so much for something like this because it is so sweet. And then the Braeburn, which is a really great blend. I find that there's a pretty complex flavor with Braeburn, and it's something that's readily available year round. So that's often a go-to apple for me for baking. I wanted to show you, anyone who is local right now to this area, there is a really exciting apple. Let me see if I can get the name right. This I found in City Market this morning, and it is the Rhode Island Greening. It had a really interesting history. It's an American heirloom variety from the 17th century, and it excels in baking. So supposedly it has enabled chefs to win international awards for their baked goods using this apple. What I really like about it, I was eating a couple this afternoon. They're really tart and really, really firm. It's an apple that should not really be harvested or eaten underripe because it's just so hard and sort of so tart. So I find that if you like the sort of Granny Smith flavor, that this would be a great apple to use. Granny Smiths tend to break down a little bit more quickly. So again, we're looking for an apple that will really hold its structure and is not going to turn into applesauce. So like a Macintosh that you'd use for your applesauce, we definitely don't want to use for something like this. If you're doing a more traditional like American apple pie, it doesn't matter quite so much because all those apples are hidden under the top crust, and they're sort of like, you know, it's like simmering in all of their juices, and it's more of a soft filling. Whereas this, we really want the apples to retain their shape for the final tart. So you're going for a hard apple. It was funny because actually earlier this week I was processing pounds and pounds of apples for an Oktoberfest event where I was making apple strudel. So I went from sort of the German apple desserts to the French this weekend. But I was actually peeling apples during a conference call, and I was noticing, because I had to be really quiet in peeling the apples, that the different textured apples have a very different sound when you're peeling and cutting them. And I found that the softer apples you could peel really quietly without anyone noticing over Zoom, but like the firmer apples like Pink Lady, it was so loud. It's sort of like, it's like this, really loud peeling sound and chopping sound. So people were actually hearing that. So I realized that sound could also be a good test for how firm your apple is. So you want the ones that are really firm, sort of hard to cut into and make a little bit of a crack when you chop into them.
So just really quick, there's a question in the chat that says, can you make with or without 2 tablespoons butter? If you could just, oh, sugar. Okay, sorry, for the apples, perhaps the apples will be sweetened with the caramel. Yes, Anna mentioned that you don't have to add the sugar into the pie crust if you don't want that extra sweetness.
Yeah, if the question was about adding the sugar to the pie crust, you absolutely don't need to add any sugar to the pie crust. You could also reduce the sugar for the caramel if you wanted. And I would say, try to keep the proportion of sugar to butter about the same, but you could reduce both if you felt like your apples were really sweet and didn't need that much caramel. The goal is also that the caramel will sort of fall back underneath the apples and like soak into the crust. So while it seems like a lot of caramel at this stage, keep in mind that when we flip the tart, the caramel is going to be soaking into that sort of thick crust. So we want it to be sort of moistening the crust and absorbed by the crust. So we do want a little bit more than we might think of originally, sort of initially. Okay, so processing apples. If you are just doing like 4 or 5 by hand, then a regular paring knife is great. I found that I was starting to get carpal tunnel syndrome this weekend, processing like 30 pounds of apples. And so what I did was rummaged in my kitchen drawer and realized that I have a corer, an apple corer. And this was really helpful. And I think anytime you're, making sauce or doing large quantities of apples, processing large quantities, this is great to have. What it does is you can sort of push it down into the core, give it a twist, pull it out, and then remove the core. And for the larger apples, it works really well. I found that for some of the smaller apples, if you're using a corer this size, it tends to be a little bit wasteful and gets a little bit more of the flesh than I might really want, but it's certainly a time saver. Another little trick you can do if you're working with a smaller apple is to cut into it and use one of these melon scoops to just sort of scoop out the seed and the ends. And that you can do really quickly, maybe a little bit faster than with a paring knife. So those are just 2 ways to help you get around that sort of delay of having to take out the core. In terms of peeling an apple, a paring knife is just fine, but I do like an apple peeler, and a quick way to do it is to just do the top and come down to the bottom, do the bottom, and then just kind of score it all the way around. It's not hugely time consuming, but it does kind of add up if you're having to process a lot of apples. It's not, it wouldn't be wrong to bake a tarte tatin with the skins. That's just not how it was done traditionally, but I'm a big fan of using all parts of the fruit or vegetable. So you could try it even with the skins. So do give yourself a little time, leave yourself enough time to process your apples. There are many points of view about best time to do that. Most of us have been taught that if we are working with apples and removing the skins, then they're going to be exposed to oxygen and brown really quickly. So we have to work fast and then like dunk them into a lemon juice solution to prevent oxidization. However, for this recipe, they are going to be completely browned in the caramel anyways, so it really doesn't matter. And actually, there are some pastry chefs, and I think it was Jamie Oliver I was reading about earlier this week, who says that actually you want to process your apples at least a day ahead of time and then put them into your refrigerator and uncovered so that the cold air basically sucks out moisture from the apples. Once you have a really dry apple, it is going to continue to release its juices when it's baked, so it's not going to feel like overly dry, but it's then not going to basically turn to mush as quickly. So I actually have done that a couple of times, and I think it's great to just, first of all, it gives you the chance to do a lot of your prep ahead of time and then just throw them into the fridge. These were chilling all day today, and I think I'm curious to see these tarts versus the ones I made this morning, how the apple texture is going to be. So just, don't feel badly if your apples are turning brown. That's not an issue at all.
We did have somebody ask, is it recommended to use an American butter with less milk fat for making the caramel?
Oh, so for the caramel, the fat content is not as essential as for the dough. So yeah, that would probably be fine. I would still say though, since we are in the realm of French baking, that as much fat content as possible for the butter, as much fat as we can get. So that if you're buying butter for the dough, I would tend to buy the same butter for the caramel, but it's fine to use a lower fat content one. Yeah.
And then somebody else asked, I read that the seeds are not safe. Is that right? I'm guessing apple seeds.
Yeah, great point. So apple seeds contain a very small amount of cyanide. We do not want to be eating them in large quantities. That said, if you consume one, generally the thought is it just passes through you and it's not going to be super toxic. But if I'm making an applesauce or any dessert, I really do try to kind of strain out or just at least remove the seeds ahead of time. Yeah, it's not like, squash seeds where sometimes I'll bake a winter squash with the seeds and they're delicious, the seeds with the flesh eaten together. Definitely, yeah, try to avoid the apple seeds, but they're not, don't be upset if you have one or two. They're probably not gonna, have much impact. I think you'd have to eat like probably a ton before you'd actually get any kind of reaction.
Yeah, we've had a few other pastry questions come through, but I think I'll wait on those until we bring the dough back out and we start rolling out the pastry to keep it
that sounds
consistent.
Great. Yeah, no, we want to get to those, but I think I'm just going to move ahead with the apples so that we can, start the tart. So there are many ways to cut your apple for a French apple tart. The original Tarte Tatin, we believe, was made with apples that were either quartered or halved. So this seems very, very large for a tart, right? I think that's because we have often, I think nowadays we see these very intricate, kind of fancy tarts with very thinly sliced apples, and that's beautiful to look at. But we believe that the earliest Tarte Tatin was pretty rustic, and there's sort of this beautiful, look to a tart that has the rounded whole fruit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this tart with the quarters, because this is sort of the most, I think, common way of making it nowadays. So you're going to cut the apple in half and then into quarters. And you see it's got the rounded side and then the flat side. So that's going to be important to keep in mind. We're going to bring over our caramel. And I'm just going to warm it up a little bit because it's gotten a little bit cooled. Generally, I would prep the apples kind of ahead of time or while you're making the pastry dough, and then while it's chilling in the fridge for that, half an hour.
Some more apple questions while we're heating that up. When do you need to peel the apple and when can you leave the peel on? I was surprised the other day when my apple cake recipe from King Arthur didn't require apple peeling.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think it's really kind of one's choice, like user's choice in a lot of these recipes. I think there's been a bit of a shift from removing the skins to incorporating the skins in desserts nowadays. Generally, I would suggest tasting the apple first, the apples that you're going to be using, and just seeing, okay, does that skin have a pretty like tart, acidic, or even bitter flavor, and how thick is the skin? And I found there's a huge range of sort of thickness and flavors with apple skins. If it's an apple where the skin just kind of like is pretty thin and works well with the overall flavor of the apple, then you could keep it on. But if you really notice that skin or you're having to really chew that skin, I would say it's worth the extra effort of removing it.
And then somebody said, back to Jamie Oliver, does he cut up the apple or leave it whole after taking off the peel before he puts it in the fridge?
Oh, yes. I believe that he was only peeling it and then putting it in the fridge. But you could completely cut it up. That would certainly add more like air. I think the more you process the fruit and the more time that goes by, the more it disintegrates, and it certainly loses like nutritional value as soon as it's exposed to oxygen. So I don't know if his thinking was perhaps to keep it, give it enough surface area exposed for the moisture to be sucked out, but still keeping it intact enough so that the fruit doesn't get sort of less flavor to it or doesn't get permeated by the flavors in the fridge. But yeah, no, that's a great question. I would try it both ways and kind of see. All right. And if anyone has any favorite apple varieties that you've been baking with already this season, feel free to type those into the chat. It would be great to hear. We'd love to, yeah, share ideas for different apples that you like. Are there stuff? Okay. Oh. Okay, so we're just warming this. And I can help in a moment too if it's, yeah. You could put it in the oven a little more, or on the burner. Yeah. So I gave Carrie the very hard task of transferring my sample tart that we're going to show you in a sec onto a plate, and this is a good lesson actually for us. This is why we only are going to leave it on the plate to cool like a couple minutes before we flip it, because it can get stuck. And same applies to when it's in the tart mold in the oven. All right, so let's pretend we've just made our caramel. We've got our apples all cut and ready to go. And for this tart, we're going to use the kind of traditional method and quarter size apple slices. So I'm going to remove the caramel from the heat and grab a dishcloth. I'm using one of City Market's cutting boards, so I just don't want to leave any sort of stain on it. So what's interesting is that I find the way to assemble the apples for a tarte tatin is a little bit counterintuitive. Oftentimes we think of the flat side or the flat surface of a fruit or vegetable as the one we're going to set down first. But in fact, if you imagine that we will be inverting the tart, we want the rounded side to be the side that's going to be on display at the final presentation of the tart. So in order for that to happen, we are going to put the rounded side down first. And for this part, you kind of want to lay it slightly on its side, and you may need both hands to do this because you have to kind of hold it up and layer them next to each other. Or you can, if you have a helper, one person, it's kind of like when you're tying a ribbon, one person could hold this side and you can keep going on the other side. You'll find that as the caramel cools, it starts to get a little sticky, and so that the caramel can actually sort of hold the apples up even. And this pan, you can see that the sides are a little bit, they sort of go out and up as opposed to a cake pan that is almost like a 90-degree angle. It's flat and the sides come straight up. And so that's going to influence the final look of your tart. So you want to think a little bit about the presentation you're going for. I just really like the sort of ease and simplicity of making your caramel sauce in the same pan that you're going to bake in. Just means less dishes, a little more efficient. But I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you later on a tart that's been plated, that's been baked in a cake pan, and we'll see how the sides are slightly different. Okay, so the apples are holding up. And what I like to do is try to look for apples that are roughly the same size to place next to each other. You're going to have a large variation of apples in any batch, and you don't want to put like an XL apple next to a smaller slice. As you're slicing them, do try to keep them as uniform as possible, but often the apples themselves are just different sizes. So that's hard to do.
Somebody said that Macs are too soft. What about combining different apples in the same tart?
Yeah, that is a great question, because actually the original Tarte Tatin, we believe, contained 2 varieties of apples. And it can be a great way, like you're suggesting, to create that sweetness, but then maybe have some apples that are really firm and maybe more acidic, and that they would blend together. And actually, let me just use that as a segue to mention, I wanted to tell you that the original Tarte Tatin, we believe, was baked with 2 French varieties. One is called Reine des Renettes, which the English name is King of the Pippins, not Queen of the Pippins, but they call it King of the Pippins, and an apple that is still nowadays accessible in the UK and parts of Europe, and I'm sure we have it at some small vineyard or small orchards here in the States. It's called Calville Blanc d'Hiver. It's an apple that ripens really late in the season, often almost into the sort of winter, that shoulder season of end of fall, early winter. And so it's called Calville, sort of the white Calville of winter, the winter white Calville. And it has a very sort of, supposedly, I've been looking at pictures of it, it's like considered to be very ugly in its exterior. It's sort of misshapen and all these sort of strange, not your typical apple shape, but it has a really, really complex and delicious flavor. It's got like sweetness, but then like tart and acidic undertones, and it's sort of a favorite apple for baking. It dates back to the 1600s. It was sort of a mistake, or it was discovered as an unintentional apple that it's part of a breeding program in Normandy in the north of France, and sort of became the favored apple for baking at that time period, and still is today in France. So if you are lucky enough to be next to any, close enough to any apple growers that might have any kind of a Calville apple, that would be really fun to look for. And I think tomorrow I'll try to send out, Carrie's going to send you a follow-up email after this class, and I will include those 2 names. So you could, go on a search for those 2 varieties if you want to try to bake it as traditional as possible. Yes, that would be great. So Carrie's going to grab the dough for us. So I've made this 1 circle. We're going to make a second concentric circle with the remaining apples. Thank you. And I like to try to save the smaller slices for the end for this part, just because it looks a little bit nicer. If I had a huge one in the center, it might sort of not look quite as presentable. But again, remember, this is a very rustic tart, and the apples are definitely going to shift during baking. There is a lot of like bubbling that happens with that caramel. And it's been interesting to see how your perfect concentric circles will sort of shift a little in the baking process. So just, keep in mind that it's going to be a little bit rustic, and that's kind of the joy of this tart. And then let's put 1 more in the center. All right, so these are in here pretty compactly. If you can sort of squeeze them in, that will reduce the shifting during the bake time. And I'm just going to set this aside. You can sort of see. You'll note that it's relatively thick, and that's because we've used the apples on the side. The original Tarte Tatin was pretty thick. It wasn't one of these like super flat, wide tarts that we sort of think of nowadays when there's like a lot of French custard tarts with apricots or apples on top of a custard, and they are baked in a pie pan, usually the ones with a removable bottom, and those are probably only about 1 inch or so thick. So just have in your mind that this is a different Tarte Tatin. The Tarte Tatin is different than those kind of flat pie shell tarts. It's going to be at probably 2 to 3 inches thick. So now we get to work on our pastry dough. Are there any questions before we jump into the dough?
There's actually a couple dough questions, but also a comment on the apples. You make the apples sound a bit like wine. For example, the Gewürz is from a cooler climate. So just a comment on apples and how they're describing.
That's a great comment. No, apples really are. And if you talk to, apple connoisseurs or apple growers, I mean, next time you're at your local orchard, have a chat with the farmers there, because apple growers are so knowledgeable, and I've just learned so much by, hanging out at orchards and talking with the growers there. They will talk about each fruit really as a favored wine. It's really interesting. And oftentimes, they're the ones who will have the best recommendations of which apples are going to work best in baking. Because everybody knows their orchard really well and what apples they like to use for different things. Yeah.
Someone asked what about puff pastry?
Oh, great question. So we're going to get to the puff pastry part in just a second. Yeah. I just want to finish with the pâte brisée. So it's chilled a bit. It's much firmer than it was before. And this last step is simply to roll it out and place it over the tart. So to do this, it's always good to flour your board and rolling pin, as well as your hands. So see, the main thing to keep in mind here is that we're aiming to get it at least an inch wider than the size of our pan. And so that's kind of your goal. You would always want to start when you're rolling dough for a tart like this. Just kind of do a quick eyeball assessment of the diameter of your pan. And
what size pan did you use?
Yeah, so this is actually the upper width is more like a 10-inch tart pan. I think the recipe is scaled for 9 to 10 inches. But you can really use any size. Probably up to 12 inches is what this dough could stretch for. And as you're working the dough, it's important to use your dough scraper to lift it up every couple of rolls, just so that we're not kind of adhering it to the pastry board. And this is where the amount of time in the fridge will really make a difference. This is a little bit under the amount of ideal time we'd want. It's a little bit soft, but that's totally fine. We just have to be a little more delicate with it. And you'll get a sense when you are rolling dough, like how much weight to push down on it. It will respond differently based on its temperature.
While you're rolling, somebody asked, can you make the tart with the crust, cover, and leave it in the fridge and I guess bake later?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I wouldn't see why not. Yeah, I think that would be okay. As long as it's pretty airtight, you just don't want that upper crust to be exposed to the air for too long. But yeah, you could experiment with that. Absolutely. I might, if I'm prepping it for a later event, I might par bake it first. So bake it perhaps 3/4 of the amount of time in the oven, take it out, and then do the final bit of baking right before. So I'm serving it hot. But you could try that. Yeah, absolutely. In the fridge.
If you do try it, write me an email. Let me know how
Let
it goes.
us know. Yes. Yeah, it's great. We've learned so much from the wider cooking community as people experiment with recipes. So one thing I like to do to get the exact size here is, it's a little bit awkward to sort of set this heavy pan down and to sort of cut around it for the correct size. So what I've done here is I have a lid that's the exact size as my pan, and I'm going to use that to measure the dough. So I think I need a little bit more rolling. And you're aiming for close to like 1/4 to 1/2 an inch in thickness. But that really is up to your own preference. If you like a more kind of thin, flakier crust versus some people like a more like hearty, robust crust, especially when you're working with the larger apple sizes, the 1/2 or 1/4 apple sizes, I find that it's nice to have a good amount of crust beneath them. You kind of want to always think about the pairing of the crust type you're using with the fruit and the size you're cutting to, and sort of something that's going to make sense together.
Somebody asked if you could elaborate on the 3/4 time, then cooking later. Do you put it in the refrigerator after baking or room temp?
Sorry, absolutely. Let me explain that a little better. So if we're baking it like maybe say the 40 minutes, I might do it bake it like 30 minutes. So it's pretty, it looks done, but it's just not going to be browned enough. I wouldn't put it into the fridge. The Tarte Tatin can stay out on the counter, you know, overnight. And it's been interesting in France. There's a much, I think it's just much more common to leave your baked goods out and not refrigerate them. So I don't think I've ever seen the tart really refrigerated. Oftentimes it will also just be consumed within like 24 hours. But then maybe just keep it out. So I might bake it like the night before, and then if I'm serving it the next day, then turn the oven back to 375 and do that remaining maybe 10 minutes, but probably more 15 minutes to give it time to really heat back up again inside. Just a note about your bake times, it's really good to have a general idea of what the time should be, but then to not be confined by the recipe instructions. It's always good to make your decision about when to pull from the oven based on the look, the smell, if you're going to test it. So what we're looking for here with this tart is the crust to become like a dark golden color. And that's going to mean that it's fully baked through, and likely the apples have softened enough and the caramel has gotten a little bit darker. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so I think we've gotten the requisite size. So I'm going to find my paring knife. Here it is. All right, so I'm going to just quickly cut around. And we're going to be tucking the edge of the pie crust underneath the apples. We're not really fluting it or doing anything fancy with it. So again, that rustic look is going to be fine. It doesn't have to be kind of super precise. But what is important is that there's a uniform thickness to the dough. I'm sure everyone's had that pie experience where it's like the first bite is delicious, but then you get closer to the crust and it's like a really thick dough, and it sort of is just like doughy and not the right ratio of sort of fruit to dough because there's too much dough. So just make sure it's all the same sort of thinness. And it doesn't matter that we sort of see this ring because we are going to be transferring it.
We had someone comment that notice when you roll center to yourself and turn. So yes, they were commenting on your great rolling technique.
Oh, thank you. That's something I actually wasn't thinking about, but thanks for bringing that up. As you're rolling, it's always great to just give that maybe like a counterclockwise turn, maybe, yeah, 3/4 or a quarter of the way around the circle each time you do it. And that will just, again, help you roll it out evenly, and it will help prevent it from sticking. So now I'm just going to make a few air holes, and you can be pretty determined with these holes because the dough is going to puff up and sort of close them off. This is really important because we want any extra air to be able to escape and not kind of like create a big bubble in the dough. Sometimes in France, they'll make just like one kind of inch wide hole in the center. So that's another option. And then we're going to bring our apples over, and I'm going to drape this over the tart. And you can do it either way, this way or the other way. And very gently tuck the crust kind of underneath the apples. And what's nice about using a pan with a handle is you can, even if it's hot, the pan is still hot, you can sort of turn it with a handle. So again, this is kind of a pretty rustic look here, but we want to get at least halfway down so that there's enough crust to, there's enough sort of structure to hold the apples once it's baked solid.
And somebody asked with the caramel sauce, what does it mean, or what do you do if the butter separates? So sort of like the issue.
Yeah.
Like, will it work?
Yeah, no, I think this will work. And I think that it could be coming from also the burner here. This hot plate is extremely hot, and my guess is that it was just like too fast, like taking the temperature up too fast, as well as maybe this particular butter had a propensity for that. I don't know, but yeah, that's a reason to kind of melt your butter quickly on medium to high temp, but then maybe take it down a little bit lower as you're adding the sugar and just kind of very gently bring it up to a higher temperature to try to, see if that will prevent it from separating. But it should, once it gets hot, it should sort of blend together, and then when you flip it, it will all kind of coat the apples, and any of that excess butter will just fall into the crust. All right.
And somebody asked, if you do the traditional inch-wide cut in the center, would you add something like a piece of brown paper to stop the liquid from leaking out? Because you're going to have a giant hole.
Right. That's a good thought. You could do that, but actually, because this is going to become the bottom of the tart, it sort of doesn't matter that much. We won't be looking at that. And the hole will sort of puff up and it won't be as big. But you could cover it with something, something oven safe if you wanted, paper. I think there used to be, I think in the south of France, I saw sometimes at markets these little like ceramic, sort of almost like a mini napkin ring that you could set in there for the hole to hold its shape. So you could, get creative with that. So my tart is ready to go into the oven. We have preheated the oven to 375, and it's always good to kind of double check your oven. If you've got a temperature thermometer, you can just make sure that it's at temp. Oftentimes ovens are widely variable, and even though you've turned it to 375, it might be lower or higher. So good to check. So I'm gonna bake.
I was just thinking, do we want to experiment with this one and refrigerate it since we have some baked ones finished to show off? And that way you can know what happens.
Yeah, so we are going to do an experiment and refrigerate it as is, and then see what happens when we bake it maybe tomorrow or the next day. Great. But if we were baking it right now, we would put that in the oven at 375 for between 40 to 45 minutes. Some recipes will call for a bake time closer to 30 minutes, but in order to get the caramel to really brown and darken the way it's supposed to for this size tart, I found that 40 minutes is really kind of the minimum. But feel free to monitor it and even take it longer if you feel like the crust isn't fully baked. So again, a lot depends on, your oven altitude, ingredients, size of the apples. So we had a question about puff pastry. So what you've just learned is the traditional method for making a handmade pâte brisée, the pastry, short crust pastry. Just a second, and it does take a little bit of time. It's pretty simple, but it is, you've got to put it into the fridge, you've got to roll it out. If you want to make a delicious tarte tatin in like 20 minutes, in no time at all, there is the option of using a store-bought puff pastry. This is a different dough. The pâte feuilletée, I think is the name in French, and the name comes from feuille, which is like a sheet of paper or like a leaf. And it's basically laminated dough that has many different, very, very thin leaves or sheets that have a butter sort of encasing between them. So that's kind of imagining it on a micro level. Then what happens as it bakes is that the dough puffs up and you get this wonderful effect of sort of billowy air between the different layers. And it's just delicious. And we've all had puff pastry and know how it sort of like melts in your mouth and is a little bit crispy. And it's great. It is possible to make puff pastry at home. It just takes a fair amount of time and a lot of different sort of rolling and turning and laminating the dough with the butter. But that's a fun technique to work on if you do want to make it at home. But if not, there are lots of different options out there. I'm using today a Pepperidge Farm puff pastry that was just available downstairs at City Market. This is probably not the top of the line puff pastry. It's actually made with margarine as opposed to real butter. So that is going to be a big flavor difference for anybody who's a real French butter connoisseur, you're going to taste that it's made with margarine. So I would recommend, there is a bakery here in the Burlington area called Mirabelle's, and they have a location in South Burlington that has really good laminated dough, and you can just buy puff pastry from them. There's another version you can purchase called Dufour, and I think it's a French company that makes it and is available at like Costco and maybe some other larger retail stores. But I would always just check the ingredients if you're purchasing puff pastry to make sure that it's got butter, if that's what you want. If you're looking for a dairy-free version, actually this type of puff pastry would be good for that, because it doesn't, it just has the margarine. And most of you probably know, if you're trying to avoid dairy, that a quick way to tell if something is dairy-free is to look at the cholesterol count. And if it is 0, that generally means there is no animal fat in the recipe, because any animal fat would provide the cholesterol. So we've got the puff pastry. It's generally kept in the frozen section. So you want to bring it to room temperature, either leaving it maybe for an hour or 2 out, or you could leave it in the fridge and then it will just take maybe half an hour to bring to room temperature. When you roll it, when you open it up, you'll see the creases, but don't worry about that, because as we roll it, it's going to become more flat and uniform. So again, what we'd be aiming to do here is roll it out very gently to the size that we're looking for. And something to keep in mind is just to always remember that shape and the structure of puff pastry is that you've got all of these different sort of leaves and layers. And so you don't want to press down too hard at all. It's a very different motion and amount of pressure than for a regular dough. You're just really being very gentle to kind of coax it out to the shape that you want. You don't want to squish it or it's not going to puff so much. So I wanted to just mention, for anybody that would be interested in trying this recipe but doesn't want to put a skillet into the oven, or doesn't have a skillet that would be oven proof, that you could just make your caramel in a regular pan, any pan that you've got, and then use a cake dish or a pie pan, pour the caramel into here, arrange your apples, and then put your puff pastry on top and use this. And that's what I've done with one of the tarts I'm going to show you today. And you'll see it has a just different appearance with the sides. But so if we imagine we're going to do that for this one, I'm going to use this as my guide and just cut out the puff pastry. And stock it a little bit with a fork. You can see it got a little bit soft, but that's going to work. And then we would just drape that over the tart in our cake pan. And then we would just bake that as we would for the regular pâte brisée for, again, 40 to 45 minutes. Oftentimes, I've noticed the puff pastry takes like slightly less time, depending on how thick you've rolled the pastry dough. But again, because of it being so thin, it tends to bake just a little bit quicker. So keep an eye on that. It will turn that sort of golden, dark gold when it's ready.
Somebody asks, after rolling out the pastry, do you place it on parchment paper and get it back into the fridge before placing it on top of the apples? But you just went directly on top, right? It doesn't need to go cold again?
Yeah, I did. It doesn't need to go back into the fridge because at that point you've rolled it and it's obtained the shape that it's going to have for baking. But you could always roll it on a piece of paper. That's totally fine. But baking sheets and butcher paper could be great because then if you're getting it stuck, it tends to not adhere so much to the paper. So if you're working with a very warm dough or a dough that has like almost too much butter, that might be something I would do. I think that actually America's Test Kitchen recently did a little sort of promo blurb on how to roll tricky doughs, challenging doughs with saran wrap. So you could just put saran wrap down and then cover it, put your dough, say That's a nice disc. And then you could cover it and roll it this way. And this is like a foolproof method. There's no way you're going to kind of ruin your dough or make it stick, because you can always then pull it off with this. And you'd of course roll it nicer than that, but you get the idea. So yeah, there are lots of little tricks for just making sure your dough isn't going to stick to the board. Yeah, so let's imagine we put our two tarts into the oven, the skillet tart and then our cake pan tart, and 45 minutes later, thank you, Carrie, for plating these, we can bring them out of the oven. So this is the skillet tart. I made this pretty much the exact same way that we saw, and the only step that I'm not able to show you because it takes so long in the oven is the plating. So imagine if this came out of the oven, what we would do is let it sit for a good 5 minutes. That's because the caramel is super liquidy when it first comes out, and the apples are just really fragile. But then once it's sat for a little bit, but not too long, or it's going to stick to the pan, then you're going to take your plate and sort of invert the plate over the pan, and then hold the plate with one hand and flip with the other. That is probably the most challenging part of this whole tart, is that flipping moment. And what I suggest is to do that over the sink or over a counter that you don't mind getting dirty. There will more than likely be caramel that does drip out of that. Oftentimes I've seen chefs use a plate with really high lips in case the caramel sort of overflows and you're going to have a little pool of caramel sort of pooling around the base of the tart. But you can also, I mentioned earlier, you can also use that two-hand approach where you just kind of put the plate down onto it and then flip it like that. Kind of depends if you want to work out your wrist or your upper arms for that one. Or it could be a two-person job too. So here's the tart. This was about 45 minutes, and you can see how the caramel and the apples has gotten a little bit browner than it was when we put it in. I think I might have even left this a little bit longer to get that sort of darker caramel, but it's hard to tell. You don't really know when it's in the oven what the caramel is doing. You can monitor the crust, and you can see my crust here is nice and sort of firm. It's probably not going to be too doughy underneath, but that's how the rounded shape of the apple looks when you've inverted it. As you can see, the skillet, you can see, also gives you a little bit more of that lip, versus the tart I baked in the cake pan is this shape. So that's much flatter. The tart sides haven't come up as high, and if I wanted to, I could have sort of forced the crust down a little bit more, but I liked, for this one, I wanted to kind of contrast it with this one so we'd see more of the apples. I did want to mention there are so many ways you can cut the apples, and I thought for this one I'd experiment to show you a slightly finer cut. So for this one, I sliced the apple into quarters like we did here, and each quarter I then sliced into, I think, 2 more times. So that, and then I tried to layer them sort of around each other, as opposed to like maybe the rounded side down. I find that with the puff pastry, it's sort of nice to have maybe a smaller cut of the apple, but you could certainly do it the same way with the bigger apples. So the big question is whether you would prefer to do the pâte brisée or the puff pastry. There's sort of a big discussion, or maybe 2 camps in the pastry world about which is better for a tarte tatin, but I think it's really up to you. It's sort of equal. I'd say maybe slightly more for the more chefs are doing the traditional sort of handmade pâte brisée. The one thing to keep in mind with the puff pastry is that because it's not as thick and robust as this the pâte brisée, it will actually get soggy more quickly, and all of that extra juice will kind of soak through. So I generally tell people, if you're baking a tart to serve right away, the puff pastry is really good and it holds up well and it really kind of shines at that moment. But if you're planning to bake the tart and then let it kind of sit and serve it at room temperature later in the day, which is often the case, oftentimes the tart isn't served hot. It can be served in a cafe, you know, just room temperature. Then it might be better to go with the crust that's like slightly, it can handle that much moisture, slightly thicker. But really, both are great. Both are delicious. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is what to serve with your tarte tatin. So traditionally, they are eaten, you know, just by itself is totally acceptable. If you are going to add something, in France, one might often find some crème fraîche on the plate, and this is a lovely cultured cream that is sort of a little similar to like a sour cream, but it's got kind of more of a creamy sweetness to it, as well as that kind of acidic flavor from the culture. So crème fraîche, fresh cream, is just delicious, and you could just put like a little spoonful on top of each slice for your guests. I think here in the States, there's a tendency to serve vanilla ice cream with a warm tarte tatin at a restaurant. That's actually a perfectly acceptable option, and is delicious too. So feel free to experiment. You know, yogurt or sour cream, any other kind of dairy would go really nicely with it. So that is that's kind of it for this evening's class to teach you how to make the tarte tatin. Are there any final questions?
Yeah, the last question that I see right now, and then we'll wrap up and say goodnight, is any suggestions for high altitude cooking? Any changes?
Oh, that's a great question, huh? You would think here in Vermont with all the mountains, I would have thought that one out. I think that my suggestion would just be to really like monitor what you're doing in terms of the baking process a little more carefully. I'd have to probably do some research to give you an exact conversion for a specific altitude, but to just, yeah, be a little bit mindful that your time and your temperature might vary. So to just watch your tart more and maybe set your timer for 30 minutes at first and then just see if it's done. Yeah, no, but good question. Yeah.
Great.
Anything else?
That is the Vermont Creamery crème fraîche, right?
Yeah.
Here in Vermont. Yeah, someone asked what brand.
Vermont Creamery. It's a delicious crème fraîche, and it's actually pretty hard to find around here, and this is a great one to be using. But yeah, I would again just say, you know, have fun with the apples that are out there. There are just so many great apples right now, and it's a wonderful excuse to, you know, traipse out to an orchard and taste all the different apples and see which one you think would be the nicest, you know, for your household in a pie. So enjoy and best wishes for your tarte tatin.
Great. Well, thank you everybody so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Thanks for working through the microphone issues with me not being on screen. I will be sending a survey link out in an email tomorrow, wanting to know your thoughts on the class, ideas for other classes that you'd like to see. And that will also include the link to where you can watch all of our other pre-recorded classes, including other ones that Anna has done for us. So definitely check those out and check out our class calendar page for some upcoming ones. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you all tuning in, and hopefully we will see you at another live stream class with us soon. Good night.